from Mills and Reeve, and he's going to be covering who to trust with your digital security. So over to you, Paul.
Get my geek on, get my geek on, get my geek on, get my geek on.
Hello. So yes, I'm Paul Knight. I'm a technology and commercial law partner at Mills and Reeve, and having been on the judging panel actually to select which 3 of the fantastic Trailblazing Tech Award entrants should present to you today, I'm really looking forward to the live demos we've got coming up at 11:40. But I'm on stage until then. Thankfully, not all on my own for the entirety. So I'm going to be joined in about 20 minutes by John, Harman, and Naomi to chat about the do's and don'ts to keep your company safe from cybercrime. But first, I want to focus on some steps that are being taken to make life more difficult for scammers and other criminals, and to simplify how we prove who we are in a secure and trusted way. And digital identity verification is one of those areas that we're increasingly getting asked to advise on and assist with. I'll give you a couple of examples to illustrate this. And there's some new legislation working its way through Parliament currently that's relevant to this area. So I want to explain what that covers. But firstly, why does this matter? Why is digital identity verification a hot topic? Well, I suspect everyone in this room has sadly heard examples of identity theft. I hope there aren't many of you that have actually been victims of that, but it's a big problem. Here's an illustration of the scale. Over 1.2 billion was effectively stolen by criminals through fraud last year, and out of that, 726.9 million is attributable to what's referred to as unauthorized fraud, which is when the account holder themselves doesn't authorize the transaction. Instead, the fraudster carries out the transaction, for example, using the victim's bank card details to purchase something online. That 726.9 million figure is very, very slightly lower than the amount attributable to unauthorized fraud in 2021. So there's been less than a 1% decrease in unauthorized fraud reported. So we haven't seen great inroads being made just yet to tackle the problem. Now, in the context of unauthorized fraud, there's essentially a failure to verify accurately the identity of the person commencing the transaction. If you want to establish that someone is actually who they say that they are, then obviously the classic way to try to do this is to meet someone face-to-face and require them to produce some form of trusted ID, like photo ID, like a passport. It's not foolproof. A fake passport might be presented and accepted in error, but it's a pretty reliable measure. It isn't very practical to do that in the online world, though. Some processes don't require face-to-face meeting, but they do require identity documents to be sent by post. That's still required in some circumstances when people apply for a UK driving licence. The detail on this slide is taken from the live.gov.uk website. Again, it's not foolproof, and it's definitely not quick. Digital identity verification speeds up the process. So from the consumer perspective, it provides a smoother onboarding experience, and it aligns to the expectation that you can sign up for a product or service very quickly and start using it immediately. Other benefits from an organization's perspective when relying on digital identity verification include reducing human error, as digital ID systems can be set up to reliably detect fraudulent and stolen ID documents and verify with a high degree of accuracy that customers are indeed who they claim to be. And you can get an improved audit trail, as securing proof of identity digitally could provide the full history of the customer due diligence and onboarding processes for compliance review. And cost effectiveness and cost efficiencies is another potential benefit, as digital identity verification could reduce the need for other resources required to identify verification manually. But at its heart, digital identity verification can be a powerful tool in the war against fraud. That's really the key benefit to my mind. And my attempt at explaining the way the tech works is that it involves collecting, validating, and verifying identity evidence and information about a person. So those are attributes. And then establishing an identity account and binding the person's unique identity to authenticators possessed and controlled by that person. And when there's a call to use it, it establishes, based on that possession and control of authenticators, that the person is indeed who they claim to be. If you can't provide the authenticator, which is typically a one-time code generated and sent to your mobile, then your identity won't be verified. Some digital identities will be created for just one type of transaction at a specific point in time, but it could be possible for digital identities to be reusable, meaning that they can be used again and again for different interactions and transactions across different organizations. And that's potentially how this technology will make the most impact. Many of our businesses need to go through new customer due diligence or know your customer KYC processes. So no doubt many of your organizations will be considering or implementing tech solutions for digital identity verification. And I believe there may be some people in the room from digital ID service providers. But to illustrate a couple of good use cases for digital identity verification from our clients, we've been working with the British Council on its procurement of a technology solution to support digital identity verification of people who sit English exams offered by the British Council around the world. It isn't uncommon for attempts to be made to obtain proof of person A's level of English language proficiency by having person B sit the exam instead, because they're more comfortable with English. If that were to happen, it is going to undermine the value of the relevant qualification, and so the British Council is seeking to protect the value of its English exams by guarding against that fraudulent activity. So in its recent tech procurement exercise, the British Council received comments and proposals from a number of tech providers, and one issue that came to light was the reluctance of some providers to make commitments about the interoperability of their solution with other systems. Now that was understood in the context actually, but it would be preferable if interoperability within the digital identity verification system could be taken as read. And the tech provider that was ultimately selected didn't raise the same concerns. And then we're also working with the Money and Pensions Service to implement the National Pensions Dashboards Programme. So once up and running, that will mean that any of us will be able to view online all our pension information collated from different pension providers on one single dashboard. So verifying the identity of someone requesting pensions information is going to be of paramount importance to guard against criminals getting access to pensions information. And the recent attack that Capita's suffered from obviously demonstrates the interest that cyber criminals have in getting access to pensions information. But with all of this, knowing who to work with is not that easy at the moment. Not least because there are numerous digital identity service providers, and just throwing out some names without any particular endorsement. Current providers in the market include DigiIdentity, Experian, GB Group, WhoYou, OneID, TrustID, and Yoti. And I could go on. And the size of the identity verification market is already significant. The numbers quoted vary a little bit from one source to another, but worldwide revenue last year was reportedly about $8.93 billion, and yet there's currently no framework within which providers should operate in the UK, which is the point Tech UK have made in their Unlocking UK Digital Identity in 2022 white paper. So this means there are several challenges in play at the moment, which include the lack of interoperability standards for digital ID systems, which is a challenge because, to maximize the value of digital identity verification and to enable a digital ID once verified to be reused by the individual so that they can deal with different organizations and remove that need to go through a proof of identity process repeatedly, it's going to be necessary for different systems and organizations to exchange data that are compatible with one another. And then lack of awareness and an absence of trust are also challenges. Because after all, without targeted regulation and a requirement for certain standards to be met, who do you know you can trust with your digital identity? So digital identity verification is an area where law and regulation can actually enhance the impact of technology. And perhaps this year, there will be legislation to deliver this. So in March, the Data Protection and Digital Information No. 2 bill had its first reading in Parliament, and it's now at the report stage in the House of Commons. It hasn't been to the Lords yet. And yes, for anyone who's particularly keen on following the progress or fate of parliamentary bills, there was previously a Data Protection and Digital Information bill that got withdrawn when the No. 2 bill was introduced. And much of the focus on the bills has been on reform of the data protection legislation, particularly the UK GDPR. That's covered in Part 1 of the No. 2 bill. And the Information Commissioner, for one, has welcomed that as a positive package of reforms. Now it's taken on board his concerns to maintain the ICO's regulatory independence from government. However, the No. 2 bill also sets out the legislative basis for a new UK digital identity and attributes trust framework, creation and maintenance of a digital verification services register for providers conforming to certain accreditation requirements, an information gateway to allow identity and eligibility checks to be made against data held by public authorities, and designation of a trust mark that can be used by accredited DVS providers registered on the DVS register. A beta version of the UK Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework has already been published by the Secretary of State, and so its effectiveness is being tested at the moment in the context of right to rent checks, right to work checks, and pre-employment DBS checks. In terms of what it is, the trust framework's a set of rules that different organizations agree to follow to deliver their services within the digital ID ecosystem. So the rules are outcomes-based. The intention is that by following them, you will achieve certain goals. They don't instruct use of specific technologies or processes, but recommend that trust framework participants follow open technical standards to strengthen interoperability between participants. There were a number of changes made for the beta version following alpha phase testing, and one of the more contentious issues is whether the trust framework participants should only share and receive identity and attribute data with and from other trust framework participants. Because while it's generally agreed that there can be significant security and trust benefits if DVS providers only work with other trust framework participants, the conclusion from the alpha testing was that mandating that could jeopardize business models of various DVS providers. So consequently, the beta version of the trust framework only goes so far as to require DVS providers to provide information on the services used in their supply chains, including whether or not those other suppliers that they work with are trust framework participants. And that information gets provided during the certification process. Be interesting to know whether this reduces any confidence in the trust framework and therefore the digital ID system. It's also been acknowledged that clarity around liability is essential for the trust framework to work. So who's going to be on the hook and for how much if there's a flaw in the digital identity verification process and fraud does occur, or someone's wrongly denied access to something, or if a security failing allows data to be attained by cybercriminals. Alpha testing concluded that actually liability between organizations should predominantly be left for them to determine through contractual arrangements. And the government gave 3 reasons for this. So firstly, they said, varying sectors, use cases, and risk appetites for organisations building and using digital identity solutions are so broad that it would be extremely difficult to agree conditions that work for all parties. Secondly, there's a desire from the market for the government to deliver only what only the government can deliver. So setting liability arrangements between commercial organisations would overstep that boundary. And then thirdly, the government's view is that industry is well equipped to manage liabilities in other areas, and the trust framework will provide the foundation upon which to build these arrangements in a digital identity context. And it's possible that the trust framework rules and certification can be used as criteria for fault-based liability. So organisations would only be liable for each other, to each other in most circumstances if they've not followed trust framework rules. That's probably going to be the position that most organisations will consider as they develop their digital ID verification commercial relationships. And as mentioned, the draft legislation also covers a DVS registration process. One of the unknowns currently is whether there'll be a fee for registering on the DVS register. So the draft legislation gives the Secretary of State the power to decide whether a fee must be paid. And there may also be cost involved in the information gateway that's referred to, as public authorities will be allowed to charge fees for the disclosure of information to DVS registered providers to enable them to provide digital identity verification services in response to someone's request for digital ID verification. Being honest, what I've taken from looking at the draft legislation and the beta version of the trust framework is that the digital identity ecosystem is pretty complex, with a variety of different types of organisations involved. So the trust framework refers to identity service providers, attribute service providers, orchestration service providers, relying parties, scheme owners, and users. And so explaining to users how their data will be used and by who in a manner that's easily understood won't necessarily be easy, but I think it's going to be really important this is done effectively, both to comply with the data protection legislation and to ensure public confidence in the trust framework and the trust mark. And the trust mark doesn't exist yet, so that purple TM that's TM in the purple circle is not it. But I believe that the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology is now responsible for designing the trust mark and working on that. And if all goes according to plan, assuming the legislation does come into force, then it should be the case that the answer to who do you trust with your digital identity becomes anyone lawfully displaying the trust mark. So that's something to look out for. Can't give you that much of a steer on when all this will come to fruition, but hopefully, having listened to all that, when you do start to see some distinctive logo appearing when you're looking to set up accounts and prove who you are online, it will make that little bit more sense. And just to finish, I did ask ChatGPT to give me a view on part 2 of the Data Protection and Digital Information number 2 bill. Its response didn't refer to this stuff. Instead, it talked about provisions for increasing the penalties for data breaches and strengthening the enforcement powers of the Information Commissioner's Office. That is so part 1. So just at the moment, there is, I think, still something to be said for human research and analysis, so don't believe everything the AI tells you. So that's my identity. If you want to sort of connect and discuss further, get in touch. Looking at time and Sam, do we move on to the panel session now?
Yes.